Okay, so we're talking about oil production in Mexico, and as we saw, oil production went up until 1981, and then it stalled. In fact, in the recent years, it has been declining, and that has a lot of people worried about Mexico's capacity to produce oil. Not to lose sight of oil production in Mexico, here's a picture of field oil production between 1970 and 2011. As you can see, from during that time interval, the oil production has steadily declined. But this is not a picture of Mexico. This is actually a picture of what has happened in the United States. So, singling out Mexico for its oil production is a wrong thing to do. Here we see the clear evidence. So, what has happened in the US? Remember, this is field oil production in the US. So, what has happened in the US, it has moved from field oil production to, during that period, mostly to offshore oil production and production of oil, the so-called tight oil. I'll talk a little bit more about that. One important thing to keep in mind about Mexico is, if you look at the production of oil in the Gulf of Mexico, this is what we see. The blue dots up at the top are all the oil fields in the US. And this is the land there, the blue part, light blue part is the ocean, and you see a whole lot of blue dots in the US in the ocean. If you compare that with what's happening in Mexico, there are very, very few blue dots in the ocean in Mexico. And the reason is that in the US, they have technology to extract oil from very, very deep water. In Mexico, we do not have that. As a result, the only part where Mexico is extracting oil, Mexico has the technology to extract oil from shallow waters. And that's all Pemex can do. So, one of the important elements of the government proposal has been to increase the oil production by allowing technology to be brought into Mexico. And the only way they can do that is through importing technology, which is at this point not possible because the Constitution of Mexico was changed in 1938 so that it is impossible for foreign companies to operate inside Mexico. Now, here's a table which shows how much of the so-called tight oil or shale oil are there in various countries. So if you look at this picture, you see that Mexico has quite a bit of shale oil and even more so shale gas, which again requires technology which is right now not available in Mexico. The only way Mexico can get that technology is through imports, and that's eliminated, not possible right now by constitutional clauses. In particular, there is one area called Chicontepec Basin where we do know there is a huge amount of shale oil available which cannot be extracted by the current technology run by Pemex. But potentially they are there. And so, to summarize the Mexican oil technology, first thing to recognize is that the oil that comes on the Mexican side of things, they are the so-called heavy oil, which means that they have more sulfur. What does that mean? That means to extract the same barrel of oil, it costs 20% more from Mexican oil that comes out. Secondly, Mexico loses, within quotes, 20% of its oil due to theft. So basically, people come in with their tank of empty tanks, load them up by perforating on oil pipeline and just steal them. If you compare that with the losses that happen in the US or Canada or any of the other developed countries, it's less than 1%. Question that you need to ask is, who buys this stolen oil? You know, it's not, a barrel of oil is not something you can sell in the street. Basically, there is a thriving black market in the US. So what they do is they load them in cars or whatever and tanks, and then just take across the border. And the important thing to remember is that US does not stop this sort of import. They let them in. Now, this black market oil can easily be stopped by not letting them in the US border. So, consider this scenario where large US oil companies get into the Mexican oil business. What is the first thing they're going to do? They're going to take every single step possible on the US side to stop this kind of theft. Which means automatically 20% of Mexican production will go up by this simple act. Secondly, the shale oil and deep water oil are the important things that the new technology is going to develop. And these are very hard to steal, because if you have a very deep water oil rig, you cannot just take your barrel and steal a barrel of oil from there. Similarly for shale oil, it requires a lot of massaging of the rocks from which they come in order to extract the oil. So the result is new oil that Mexico is going to generate through the new technologies would be harder to steal. So how is the new oil business going to be divvied up? Pemex will stay as the current business of extracting oil as they are right now. However, new oil coming from deep water and from the shale oil business will be dominated by large companies, large global companies like BP, Shell or ExxonMobil. How much can they generate? Well, they can actually generate up to 1% of GDP within 5 years. So, if we have these technologies coming in, it's possible by the end of this sexennium, Mexico's GDP will go up by 1% or higher just from this additional oil, which obviously means that that will give a boost to the Mexican productivity, at least over the medium term. And the idea is that because Mexico's industry pays 50% higher energy costs than its corresponding counterparts in the US, because it costs that much more in Mexico. Therefore, additional oil would reduce the energy cost, and therefore it will help Mexican export. And as we saw, Mexico's export is very, very tightly related to the US, so this is not a pie in the sky kind of scheme. It can actually happen. The smaller ones, there have been other things, for example in telecommunication, and there has been a duopoly in telecommunication, basically in mobile telephony market. There's one company, Telmex, that dominates the field. In television, it's split between two TV companies. So this has been, the proposal has been that there would be other companies would be allowed to operate there, and these companies cannot bid into that market at all. The economists had produced a set of things that what are the things that the Mexican economy needs to do in order to boost its GDP growth. I'm not going to go through that, but let me just mention a couple of things about those who are very optimistic about this process. Remember, in the 1990s, Mexico did a whole bunch of good things which were considered globally as the right things to do. For example, it lowered tariffs on its products, it joined the OECD, it negotiated free trade agreements, it formed part of NAFTA, and probably the most important part was floated its currency. So, if you go back in the middle 1990s, people were saying, well, Mexico has done all these things and therefore the Mexican economy is going to grow. But what we saw, that's not what happened. So just to see how much Mexico changed, so for example, here's Mexico's free trade agreements with various countries. So if you look at Mexico's free trade agreement, it has free trade agreement with 80% of world's GDP. So you would expect Mexican export to explode. You would expect, people in European Union to buy a whole lot of Mexican export. That hasn't happened. Mexico still exports 90% of its goods to the US. So things have not changed the way that were envisioned with these sorts of processes. At that time, politicians said, well, this is going to really make Mexico take off. It did. What did happen, for example, in terms of floating of currency is that Mexico's peso has become one of the large traded currency in the world. In fact, the largest traded currency among the third world countries, Mexico ranks number 1. It trades more than the Chinese currency, New Zealand currency, etc. Except for the top developed countries, it has more transaction on Mexican peso in the global market than any other country, which actually bodes well, because that says that in the future Mexico's currency will be more stable. Right now it is not, but in the future we expect it to be so. And as I mentioned, tariffs have also been slashed. If we go back to 1981, the tariffs have been in Mexico in the order of 30%. By the end of 2000, it was down to less than 5%. And that tracks pretty much Canada and the US. So this is what has happened in the past, but we have not really seen the results that they are supposed to bring in. In fact, results have been pretty disappointing in these fronts. Mexico's economy did not really take off. What did NAFTA do? Well, there had been great hopes about NAFTA is going to bring in a lot of changes in Mexico's industry and raising living standards. What we observed, however, is something disturbing. Countries which did not go for free trade agreement, such as Brazil or Costa Rica, have had higher growth rate than Mexico. So this is really the disturbing part. What we do observe is that as a result of NAFTA, the top 10 or 20% of the population have really benefited. They have gotten goods of better quality and so on, but it has not really trickled down to the rest of the population as much. So that's all I have to say about all these things, and thank you.